It's about time for us to begin our studies. If you will, open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 7, and we're ready for verse 4. Hebrews 7, verse 4. Hebrews 7, verse 4. Before we begin, we're going to ask you to bow. We're going to ask Mr. Jack, if he will, to lead us in a word of prayer. And as far as I know, the sick are about the same. I don't know of any different in any of them. Some are better and are able to be back with us this morning. But let's be sure to remember them. And so we'll ask Mr. Jack when he gets ready there to lead us in prayer. Did you get it? There you go.
Almighty God and Holy Father, we come before your throne of grace this morning, thanking you, Father, for the time that's set aside that we could assemble ourselves this morning and worship you. Pray, Father, that our worship this morning will be pleasing in your sight and we'll glorify your name. Father, I'm mindful of all our young men and women that serve in our country. I pray your blessings on them and their family, Father, and I pray that you'll keep them out of harm's way until they could be returned back to home to the family and friends. Thank you for this congregation, Father, and ask you to bless all them, Father. Pray that you go with us on through this service. Give us all a good rest of the day, Father, and we'll pray that you bless us and give us good health. These things I pray to you in Jesus' name.
Amen. Here, Mr. Jack. You know, one of the things that's been taken under consideration in Hebrews 7 is talking about the greatness of Melchizedek. Who's he being compared to? Well, eventually get to Christ, isn't he? But, all right, mentions Abraham, but who else? Well, it'd be Aaron, and of course the priesthood that would come from the Levites and the Levitical priesthood. Now, in what ways was Melchizedek greater even than Abraham, through which Levite was a descendant? In what way was Melchizedek greater? That's okay. I do that all the time. So,
he was a high priest.
Okay. He was a high priest and a king. Okay. We can see that. And obviously Abraham was not that. Though the Levite that descended from Abraham would have had a priesthood, didn't he? But what else can you think of? Why Melchizedek was so great? All right, Abraham paid tithes to. That's one of the things that's emphasized, isn't it? You know, the person that pays tithes to someone else usually is an indication that the person that actually paid the tithes was lesser than the person that received the tithes. And that's one of the things that's emphasized in these particular verses. Any others that you can think of? All right, no beginning and no end, at least no genealogy record, and that would be what he indicates from that. Ms. Fern? All right. Well, that would be Christ. Christ would be greater, would be without sin. Melchizedek, of course, did, but yeah. Yeah, he was made like the Son of God. Actually compares him to that, doesn't he? And compares him to that priesthood. And really the emphasis is upon, eventually gets to the fact of, the priesthood of Christ is greater than the Levitical priesthood of which these Jewish Christians seems to want to go back under the law. Anything else that you can think of? Preach continually? All right. And that's the thing that he emphasizes concerning Melchizedek. Do we have a record of Melchizedek's priesthood beginning? No. Do we have a record of it ending? No. And so we don't have a record of either one of those things actually happen. And this is one of the reasons that he's compared to, Christ's priesthood is compared to Melchizedek. But he's talking about the greatness of Melchizedek versus Abraham and also the Levitical priesthood. Abraham would be the great-grandfather of Levite, the great-great-grandfather of Aaron. And so, and those that served in the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, what was the thing that qualified them to serve as in that priesthood? All right, so they had to be from the tribe of Levi. Melchizedek wasn't from the tribe of Levi. Have you ever gone back and looked at the lineage of Abraham? Who was Noah's son that Abraham descended from? Shem. Okay, Shem. So now then, Melchizedek. Do we know which one of the sons that he descended from? Well, we don't know. But do you suppose it would have been one of the other sons other than Shem? All right. Most likely it would have been one of the other sons. Ham or Japheth would be probably the other son. We don't really know because there's nothing mentioned concerning that. But all these things are to point out the greatness of Melchizedek's priesthood. And of course, eventually, it gets to the ideal of the priesthood of Christ and how far superior Christ's priesthood is over the Aaronic priesthood or the Levitical priesthood. And that's the point that he's talking about. Verse 4 says, now consider how great this man was. What man? All right, so it'd be Melchizedek is the man that he's talking about. He said to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. Did that show somewhat the greatness of Melchizedek, as we said, because Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek? Well, obviously that tells us a little bit of the greatness of this particular man. He was a priest and a king. We have no record of him becoming priest and king, but yet he served in that capacity. And Abraham, as he's coming back from the slaughter of the kings, when he goes and delivers Lot, his nephew, he comes back and he takes of the spoils, all the spoils from the kings that he defeated, with those 318 men. He comes back, and obviously he passes through. You can look on your map and you can see this, that he would pass through. Of course, he talked about him being king of Salem, which would be the king of Jerusalem. He passed through Jerusalem, and he offers sacrifice or offers a tithe to Abraham, it seems, as he passes through that particular city. Here he's talking about considering how great this man was. Now, but he also says, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. Now, it was some 400 years later, my understanding is, that the law of Moses was given, where they were commanded to tithe. What does the word tithe mean? A tenth, isn't it? They had to give a tenth of what they possessed. Well, if you go back and look at all the laws concerning the law of Moses and what was required of the Jews, it actually would mount up to more than just a tenth, that most likely that they gave, but they had to give a tenth at least that we can see. And of course, this was 400 years prior to that time, so we see that they were already tithing or paying or giving at least a tenth of the things that they had. It's kind of interesting here that he says he gave a tenth of the spoils. What are the spoils that he's talking about here? Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of interesting the things that they might have with them, obviously, as they're off doing battle, but whatever it was that they had with them, as they were defeated, they could actually take that from them. And of course, the spoils of that victory, maybe the cities around where they defeated them as well. And so there would be any number of things that might be available to them. And so here Abraham takes the spoils of the war. Now, this word spoils carries with it a little different idea than maybe what we think of it as really being. We understand that the spoils of war, you know, just like wars that our country's been involved in, and there's killing and stuff, you know, you hear of stories that people tell, you know, the watches or rings that they might take from someone that they killed, or whatever it was that they had that was of any value whatsoever. We see sometimes that villages would be entered into, and those that would be doing battle, if they found something that was valuable, that they would take it, and various things like that. But it involved those kind of things in this verse, but the definition of it, it means the best of the warfare spoils. In other words, Abraham didn't just give him a tenth of everything that he took, but he gave him the best of what he took. So, does that tell you then what Abraham thought of Melchizedek? It tells us a little bit of what Abraham thought about him, doesn't it? It tells us of the high esteem that Abraham held Melchizedek in. Though there's not, as we said, there's not much said about Melchizedek. In Genesis 14, there's 3 verses there, and in Psalms 110, verse 4, I believe, there's one of the verse. And really, there's nothing else in the Old Testament said about Melchizedek at all. And what we learn about the greatness of Melchizedek really comes from the book of Hebrews, and we see how great a man he really was. And that's really what the writer of the book of Hebrews is emphasizing to us. I dare say that we could read Genesis 4 and Psalms 110, and we wouldn't get the greatness of this man just from those verses. But because of what God says to us through this writer, then we can see how great a man he really was and how that was applied. Vicki?
I was also thinking when you said that Abraham gave the best of the spoils, when the law was put into effect, the sacrifices, they were told to give the best.
They were.
Something
Yeah.
was damaged or not
Yeah.
perfect, they weren't supposed to give that. And I can't remember whose sons were taking the best. I didn't my father's and stuff.
Samuel's sons, I think.
And they would take the best that was supposed to
Yeah.
be offered for the Lord and,
Yeah.
and take it for themselves instead of giving it to God.
Yeah, and actually Samuel was condemned because he didn't rebuke his sons, and he continued to allow that to happen, as I remember the stories himself. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing as you think about that, and think it's good that you brought that up, because as we think about that, and what it is that we offer to God, what do we offer to God? What are we supposed to offer to Him? Our best. But what is it that we sometimes offer to Him, though? Yeah, leftovers. Yeah. Yeah, that's the sad thing about it, isn't it? Do you ever run across somebody that says, well, you know, if I'm not busy today, I'll come worship? What is that when you have that attitude? That's leftover. That's leftover time, isn't it? In other words, if I have a little time left, I'll do that. Or when you look at your wallet, when the collection plate is passed around, for lack of a better term, you hadn't already purposed in your heart your giving, and you look for your smallest bill. What's that? That's leftovers, isn't it? Do you think we're guilty of that sometimes? Just like somebody's sick and in the hospital and need to be visited. Well, if I'm not too busy tomorrow, I'll go see them. Is that leftovers? Well, we have to be careful that we're not guilty of those same kind of things, which is a really valuable lesson for us, I think. But as we said in these verses, we can see how great Melchizedek was. Now he said, consider how great this man was. Was his greatness attributed to his moral greatness or the position that he held? What do you think it was? Morally, was he more righteous, more holy than Abraham? You think? Position? I think you're right, Jerry. I really believe that's what he's talking about. You know, it's hard for me to imagine that Melchizedek would rise that much above Abraham. Particularly when you see that Abraham is the one that's mentioned in the hallmark of faith. And not only is he mentioned there, he's mentioned twice there for two acts of faith that he demonstrated his great trust in God. One, as we've already noted, leaving Ur of the Chaldeans. And then the second was the greatest act, was the fact that it was required of him to offer his son as a sacrifice, and he willingly did that. So it's hard for me to imagine that Melchizedek would exceed him morally. And so it seems to me that he's probably talking about the position that he held, that he was both priest and king. Now that doesn't mean that Melchizedek wasn't a moral man, because I think he was. I don't think he'd have been selected by God to be in that position and be held up as an example to all the Jewish people and to Jewish Christians and to you and I as well, of how great a man Melchizedek was. We just don't know a whole lot about him, but I really believe his greatness has to do with his position and not so much his morals. Not that he wasn't a moral man, I think he was. But it tells us that we can please God. To me, that's one of the great things about the book of Hebrews and Hebrews 11, and that is, you know, Enoch walked with God for 300 years, and he had a testimony that he pleased God. So we can please God. We can please God by our conduct, by the way that we live, the way that we conduct ourselves, by the way that we think, the way that we act, and the things that we do or don't do. And so, but here he's talking about how great a man he really was. Now, Abraham is called a patriarch. What is a patriarch? Head of a family, okay. And from which a family descended from or came from. And certainly that's the ideal that's behind the word here. A patriarch is the patriarch, the father or founder of a family or of a tribe. And of course, there's what we refer to as the patriarchal law. Why do we call it the patriarchal law? It's given to the fathers, and given directly to them, spoken to them. It's different from the law of Moses, because the law of Moses, patriarch was given to the head of a family. The law of Moses was given to a nation. And the law of Christ, how would you describe it? Given to the world. So look at the progressive nature of God's law. Family, nation, to the world. And it's that law, the law of Christ, that you and I are to be subject to and to submit to. But this is what he's talking about. Now, greater than Abraham. Think, and we talked a little bit about this. You know, he's described to us as the father of all believers. And he's called the friend of God. And he's the one that God blessed with a victory over all these kings that he's talking about, where he got these spoils. And he's the one that God had made those promises to as well. He promised him that he would make of him a great nation, that he would give him a land, that he would bless those that blessed him and curse those that cursed him. And it would be through his seed that all families of the earth would be blessed. And so there's at least 4 things that's involved, and probably some other things that we can look at as well. But there's at least 4 things involved in the promises that God made to Abraham. Now, why do you think God made those promises to Abraham? Because he was insignificant? Because he was unrighteous? You know, right the opposite of that would be true. But yet, in spite of how great Abraham was, he exalts Melchizedek even above Abraham. And Abraham pays Melchizedek tithes. And over in this text, that's one of the things that he's doing, is showing the superiority of Melchizedek over the Levites and over Abraham himself, of which the tribes of Levites descended from, and of course the priesthood, the Levitical priesthood and the Aaronic priesthood, high priesthood also. All right, any questions over verse 4? Don? Mm-hmm. It does. It shows the kind of person he really was. You're right, Don. And the thing about it is also is why he said he didn't want to take the spoils. He didn't want them to say, I think it was the king of Sodom, that the king of Sodom had made him wealthy. God was the one that made him wealthy, and he wanted them to understand that. It had nothing to do with the king of Sodom. And so Abraham wanted them to understand where his wealth actually came from. That speaks volumes of him too, doesn't it? I'm glad you brought that up, Don. That's a great point. And it tells us a lot about an individual when you see that. You know, he wasn't wanting those accolades for himself, but he wanted to praise God and thank God for his blessings and the things that he has. Well, there's a good lesson for us in that, isn't it? You know, everything we have, we ought to thank God because he's the giver of all good things that we really have in life. That's for sure. All right, any other thoughts about verse 4? Look at verse 5. Said, indeed, those who are the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. Now, the Levites received tithes, but now, did they receive tithes because of their greatness or because of who they descended from? It's who they descended from, isn't it? So now, the sons of Levi who received the priesthood, they received the priesthood. They received it because of who they descended from. But they have a commandment to receive tithes from the people. But Abraham, did he voluntarily give tithes? And did he understand the greatness of Melchizedek with whom he paid those tithes to? He gave him the spoil, the best of the spoils. Well, he understood that, didn't he? And certainly under the law, they were commanded to pay tithes. Now, what did the Levites not have that the other people had? All right, the lands, okay. They were given sections of land. What were the Levites given? They were given cities. There's a difference between, you know, quite a bit of land, vast amount of land, versus cities within those 12 tribes themselves. But that's what the Levites were given. And God told the people, the other 11 tribes, that they were to take care of the Levites. And they were to provide for them. And they provided for them through tithes. Now then, once the Levites received tithes, you can go back to Leviticus 17 and 18. He deals with the giving of tithes. Once the tithes were given to the Levites, then those that would serve in the priesthood, wherein did they receive tithes from the rest of the tribes of Levi so that they could serve as priests and do the things that they needed to do? You know, that's one thing that we can see in it. The people paid tithes to the Levites because they had received as an inheritance in the land, as we said, allotted. In turn, when the Levites received tithes, they had to offer tithes to the priest. They had to give tithes to the priest as well, themselves. You can go back as I said, Numbers. I think I said Leviticus. Actually, it's Numbers. Numbers 17 and 18, and you can read concerning that. And so there was a whole system of tithes, but they had to pay or give those tithes because they were commanded by God. It's what God required of them. But Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek simply because of his greatness and because, too, of the kind of man that Abraham was. He recognized the greatness of Melchizedek. Now, it's kind of interesting how he knew all this about Melchizedek. Not a lot of information supplied to us concerning that, but some way he knew that, and he knew the kind of man that Melchizedek was. It was during the days of the patriarchs, sometimes God spoke directly to the fathers. He spoke directly to the fathers, sometimes through angelic beings or other means as well, so that they might know what God wanted them to know. And certainly that may well have been the case here. But that's the point that he's talking about. He says, and of course, he said that is from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. Did they all come from the loins of Abraham? All those 12 sons of Jacob. They all came from Abraham, the loins of Abraham. What does he mean when he calls it the loins of Abraham? What's loins? Seed of Abraham. You know, that's kind of what he's talking about here. And really the term itself, according to Mr. Thayer, it's defined as the fruit of the loins. It says offsprings to come forth out of one's loins, that is, his descendants, one's origin or descent from one. And so in other words, from the loins of Abraham, they were simply descendants of Abraham. And of course there was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons, of which Levi was one of those sons. Any other thoughts about that? About verse 5. But he's simply pointing out here, and of course he's going to get to something concerning the fact of how Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek, basically. And it would be through, as Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, and they came from the loins of Abraham. And so in essence, or in a figurative sense, or in a metaphorical sense, they paid tithes to Melchizedek. Once again, showing the greatness of Melchizedek himself. But that's what he's pointing out in this. Any thoughts? Look at verse 6 then. He says, but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. Now, obviously, this ties in with what's said back in verses 3. And what he says back in verses 3 is, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Mike pointed that out to us just a moment ago. But he whose genealogy is not derived from them. Now, who is the first part? He. Who's the he? Melchizedek, isn't he? And he said his genealogy is not derived from them. Who's the them? All right, the tribe of Levi. He says, but they received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. So he emphasizes once again the promises that God had made to Abraham. And he had made him promises, pointing out the greatness of Abraham, but also it points out the superiority of Melchizedek as well. That he didn't descend from the tribe of Levi, but yet he was a high priest and he was a king. And as being a high priest, he received tithes from Abraham, and through his loins, of which the Levi came. So through Abraham, it was just as if they themselves had paid tithes to Melchizedek. So once again, emphasizing the priesthood of Melchizedek is superior to the priesthood of the tribe of Levi. You know, sometimes maybe you've talked to your father or your grandfather or something, and they remind you of something that somebody in the past did for them and how they may have done a good deed for them. Did they hold them in high esteem, you think, for the deed maybe that they've done? And that they felt some sort of obligation because of the greatness of that person, because of how that person has treated them? Well, that's kind of what God is doing here with Melchizedek. He's made a high priest and king. He's great in God's eyes. And then Abraham paying him tithes. And he wants them, the Jews that descended from the tribe of Levi and the Levitical priesthood that they wanted to go back under, he wanted them to see the supreme obligation really that they'd had to Melchizedek and how they paid him great honor through Abraham and by Abraham offering tithes to them. So he wanted them to see what Abraham had thought about Melchizedek. Because what Abraham thought about Melchizedek and by him paying tithes to them, there was that obligation that they should have had to honor Melchizedek just like their forefather Abraham did, because he understood the greatness of Melchizedek, and so should they. As I said, Abraham descended from Shem, and most likely Melchizedek probably did not descend from him, one of the other sons of Noah, but regardless of which one it was. But he mentions once again, as he said, and blessed him who had the promises. God made the promises to Abraham. As we talked, at least there are 4 great promises that God made to him. As we said, the making of a great nation, the land, and so on. But over and over, he's emphasizing the greatness of Melchizedek to that of Abraham and the priesthood of Melchizedek. Okay, any thoughts about verse 6? Just kind of repeating over and over throughout these verses the same idea. But once again, he's just emphasizing how great this man really was. All right, look at verse 7. He said, now beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Without contradiction, what does he mean? Somebody said something I didn't.
Without dispute.
All right, without dispute. Some translations translate it that, without dispute. Mine simply says beyond all contradiction. What does the American Standard say, Mike? Without dispute. Without dispute. Don, English Standard?
Mine reads, but without any dispute.
Without any dispute? Okay.
And to me here, he's bringing in Melchizedek
Right.
as sort of a go-between the old and the new, which is going to
Okay.
be Christ. If Melchizedek was better than Abraham,
Right.
Christ, the old has to be done away to establish the new. And Christ is so much better than Melchizedek.
Well, Christ is far superior to Melchizedek. One is that though there's not a record of Melchizedek's beginning and end, was there a beginning and end? Well, we know there was because he was human. Melchizedek, was he a sinner? Now, he doesn't talk about his sins, but we know he is because we know it was because of what's said in Romans 3. We know that. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But that doesn't stop the fact that he was great. But Christ's priesthood far exceeded that. What does the English Standard say, Don? So it says beyond dispute as well. So, and many of the translations say that. So if something is beyond dispute or beyond contradiction, what is it? It's true. You can rest assured of that. Without controversy, without question, and without strife. And so beyond contradiction then, he says, the lesser, who's the lesser? Abraham, okay. Blessed by the better. Who's the better? Melchizedek. And so whether an individual wanted to accept that or not, this is what God said. This is without contradiction. Did God know? God knew, didn't he? And once again, I don't think it's so much dealing with the morals of the individual as it is the position that he held. But it did involve morals, because I don't think he would have been considered the high priest and the king of Salem if he wasn't a moral person in the eyes of God. You know, God wouldn't bestow that honor upon just anybody, would he? But it was a person that obviously was a moral person that served in that capacity. But it involved the position when you're talking about Abraham, because Abraham was that kind of person as well. He was a moral person, but he just wasn't a high priest and he wasn't a king. But you know, I think as you look through the book of Hebrews, you can see the kind of people that God has used throughout the history. You know, I mentioned this morning on the radio broadcast that the men and women of Hebrews 11 are not superhuman beings. I mean, you know, they're not a Superman or a Batman or something that in the minds of our kids or some great heroes or something like that. You know, they were just common men and women like you and I, but they were men and women of great faith and great trust in God, and were obedient to God and did what God told them to do. That's the kind of people that they really were. And that's the kind of people we can be also. Vicki?
I sort of have a question.
Sure.
Now, because of Melchizedek's heritage or whatever, You say that he had to be picked by God because nobody else could pick him to be high priest, right? Because there was no high priest then. And could you correlate it and say that for us, God picked our high priest when he sent Jesus?
Well,
There was a parallel there?
well, I don't know that. Of course, the selecting of Christ as our high priest was according to the foreknowledge of God. And so that was part of God's plan from the beginning. And so I couldn't say that concerning Melchizedek because there's not a verse that would tell us that it was according to the foreknowledge of God that he was selected to be a priest and be a king. And so I couldn't say that because there's no verse that would indicate that. But there are verses that indicate and tell us plainly in Acts 2, that Christ was selected by the foreknowledge of God. That was part of God's plan from before the foundation of the world, that Christ Jesus would come into the world. But I certainly don't think that God probably just maybe without any thought at all of the kind of person that he was selecting to be a high priest. It was prophesied, and he swore that in Psalms 110 and verses 4, that Christ would be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so exactly how God arrived at him being selected to be a high priest and king, I can't say for sure because there's no indication of that. But could God look into the future and see one that he could select to be that and who he could compare his son to? Absolutely he could. And certainly that is indeed the case. But he can use the choices, even the bad choices of man, to accomplish his purposes in life. It shows that he doesn't depend on what man may or may not do, but he can still work his purposes and accomplish his end in spite of what man may decide to do and how they may reject. It's just like when Christ came and he was rejected by man. Did God still, though, establish his kingdom, even despite the fact that they rejected Christ? It's not as the premillennialists say that he came to set up a kingdom and because they rejected Jesus that he set up a church instead. No, that's not the case at all. He came to establish a kingdom and he established that kingdom. Mark 9 verses 1 says that there's some standing there that would not taste death until they see the kingdom come with power. And then in Colossians 1, we see that they were translated into the kingdom of the Son of his beloved. And then we see the kingdom in existence in Revelation 1. And even Jesus Christ, he said, I will not drink this fruit of the vine with you until I drink it new with you in my kingdom. And then we see in 1 Corinthians 11 that he was drinking it with his people. And so obviously the kingdom had been established. And it wasn't, as the premillennialists say, that he came to establish a kingdom and because they rejected him, he established a church instead. No, that would be saying that man had the power and the ability to hinder God's progress or to stop God from doing what he had planned to do. And that's just not the case at all. But he did do that and he did accomplish that. But whether God, and God could know this, God could know the kind of person that Melchizedek was, and that he would appoint him priest and king. And then, of course, but it was according to the foreknowledge of God that Jesus was selected to be our high priest and to serve in that capacity. That's what God intended. And he intended for his son to come and to suffer and die for us. And, and I think that tells us the great love that God has for us. He loves us immensely that he would give his son to redeem us and to save us, a sinful people and a sinful world, but yet he still loves us and wants us to be saved. Okay, any other thoughts about verse 7? Okay. Lesser, as we said, is defined as in rank. And that's how Thayer defines it. And so better in value or dignity, nobler, more excellent. And nobler may be carried with it the ideal of being high priest and king. And so he was that. So here's a high priest and a king, blessed Abraham. It wasn't that Abraham morally was inferior to Melchizedek, but in position he was, as we can see. And that seems to be the idea. Okay, any thoughts about verse 7? Okay, look at verse 8. He said, here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witness that he lives. Now, once again, he's continuing his ideal of the priesthood of Melchizedek. Now, here he refers to the Levitical priesthood. Here, mortal men receive tithes. So now, who is it that he's talking about receive tithes? And who were the mortal men? Or it'd be the Levites. Now then, let me ask you this. He says, here mortal men receive tithes. Does that tell us that the temple was still standing when the Hebrew writer wrote this? Is that not what that indicates? Pretty well indicates that. When was this book written? You remember what we said the book was written? I think you said it. What did you say?
Well, I said 61, but I don't know.
Okay, it'd be a little later than that, but that's pretty close. Some people would say from 64 to 66 AD. When was the temple destroyed? In 70 AD. So this could have been as much as 6 years previous to the destruction of the temple. Were the Levites still receiving tithes when this book was written? Well, they were, because the temple was still standing. The Judaism was still in existence at that time. They were still offering animal sacrifices. They were still receiving tithes, and they were still doing those things that they had always done. And so he says, here mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witness that he lives. Now, who's the he that receives them? Wouldn't that be Melchizedek? Notice that he says there. Some try to indicate that he's talking about Christ receiving tithes from his people. No, that's not talking about Christ, because it says there. And he refers back to what he had been talking about back in the book of Genesis, in Genesis the 14th chapter. So it's here versus there. Here mortal men receive. There he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. So how is it witnessed that he lives? How do we know that Melchizedek lives? And how did he witness that he lives? Is that a puzzler? Nobody's saying anything. All right. I think you're right, Vicki. The witness part of this would be the fact of the testimony that's given to us in the book of Genesis of what happened, that Abraham did indeed pay tithes to Melchizedek. The witness that he lives is that we have no record of what? Yeah, we have no record that he died. That doesn't mean that he didn't die, but that just simply says we have no record of that. Understand that throughout this text, he's been talking about it from the standpoint of something that's figurative verses and metaphorical versus that which would be physical. All right, we'll say more about that Wednesday night. Any thoughts? Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you.